Okay, well, hello, everybody. I am so excited about recording this podcast, which I am provisionally titling Barry Wehmiller's Bold Experiment in Prosocial Cultural Evolution. What might that mean? And what we have here are three senior staff members of this manufacturing corporation, Barry Wehmiller, and Michael Pirson, a professor at Fordham University, who has a very strong connection with Barry Wehmiller. This follows a podcast that I've done with Bob Chapman, the CEO of this corporation, plus Raj Sisodia, one of the founders of the conscious capitalism movement. And they wrote a book together called Everybody Matters. And so this remarkable case that we'll be studying is already well known in book form, and yet not as we're going to unfold it. So let me have some introductions in order of seniority, I'm told. So Rhonda, that makes you the first to go.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Rhonda Spencer. I lead the people organization at Barry Wehmiller, so technically Chief People Officer. I have been with Barry Wehmiller for 33 years, so I have seen the evolution of this culture and been fortunate enough to be part of it. And just a really interesting journey. I started as a mechanical engineer in the project engineering group, building breweries in Mexico. It didn't go so well. They had never heard of a woman engineer. I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't speak Spanish as well as I thought. But I did not get fired, and I ended up eventually going into sales and leading sales for North America when I was 27. So I think about the company back then, I say it was kind of like the wild, wild west. If you had a brain, a pulse, and ambition, not necessarily in that order, you could get promoted. So I ended up leading sales for North America. And when my kids were little, I asked Bob Chapman to do something flexible. And so that's how I wandered over to the people side of the business. And so I think at that time, Bob was really beginning his success to significance journey. Our task was to reinvent sales, but on that journey of reinventing sales, he started to have what he called some of his revelations. And so myself and then Brian was the first person that joined me to do this. We started to put structure around all these ideas that Bob was having. And our joke at Barry Wehmiller is this: if this was the Wizard of Oz, Bob is not the wizard, he's the tornado. So he brings all this energy and all these ideas and all this passion. And we built a team of people who would put structure around that. So as he was starting to discover that as we're different as leaders, people are different in response, then we put structure around that and figured out how you bring that to life and actually create a culture around that. So about 10 years ago, our head of HR was retiring. And I had actually just come from a class with one of Raj's friends, Sri Kumar Rao, called Creativity and Personal Mastery. And it's a series of sort of meditations and bringing Eastern wisdom into business thought. And so in this class, I had done this meditation called alternate reality. And it's this idea that you have a problem, but there's an alternate reality where every assumption that you have about that problem is completely wrong. And so there's a whole different set of assumptions. So I thought, well, I don't really have any problems. So the only thing I could think of is that I don't have time for everything that's important to me. So I decided that I do have time for everything that's important to me. Literally went from there to the board meeting. The board members after dinner said, hey, why don't you just take over HR and add that to your team of organizational empowerment? So I said, sure, in my alternate reality, I have time. So I spent the last 10 years learning everything I never wanted to know about HR.
Wow. All right. That's so much to say about that. But let me proceed directly to Brian. So Brian, you're next in seniority.
Yeah, my name is Brian Wellinghoff. I'm the Senior Director of Leadership and Outreach. It's my 21st year now at Barry Wehmiller, and having the honor of being under Rhonda's care and leadership that entire time. But what I like to tell people is I've reinvented myself multiple times in Barry Wehmiller. I think I've had 8 or 9 different roles in those 21 years, and it's allowed, as the organization has grown, it's allowed me to grow with it. I'm somewhat famous for asking Bob the question 18 years ago now, what his greatest fear was. And he tells the story at dinner, what young kid would be stupid enough to ask me this question? Because I'm the eternal optimist. Why would I focus on what my fears are? But it led us to a great revelation for him, which was his greatest fear, even 18 years ago, was that what we'd started to build in this leadership culture at Barry Wehmiller wouldn't last beyond his time. And so echoing Rhonda's statements, we built a team, and I'm honored to be a part of that, that puts structure and discipline and longevity and repeatability around Bob's many innovative ideas and adding a couple of ours in along the way. So I'm actually a mechanical engineer by training, though I never actually designed anything at Barry Wehmiller, and I don't think the organization would want me to. But I'm honored to get to design curriculum, leadership experiences, meetings, executive sessions, a whole host of different things. And more recently, have been honored to work with Michael and others to help bring this passion for truly human leadership, humanistic leadership, to colleges and universities and business associations. We believe, and Simon Sinek actually called us this, we would be stingy if we came across some really powerful ideas and practices and didn't share them with the world. And so that's the honor that I get, is to both share them inside Barry Wehmiller to new and growing leaders, and then also outside Barry Wehmiller to colleges, universities, and a whole host of other associations.
Yeah, well, let me flag a couple things before proceeding to David. One is the need for structure. Right? Without structure, you just have a tornado, and so that's like super important. And it's what the core design principles are all about, basically, is structure. And the reason that this conversation will go beyond, expand upon a conversation with Mr. Tornado, Bob Chapman. I don't know what Raj is, where Raj is in the Wizard of Oz. I'm not even going to go there, so the need for structure, and then the need for an individual to be replaced by a group. I think that's so important. So to be outlasting the founder, and then to spread. I mean, it's not even enough to become a group that outlives the founder. That group must give rise to other groups. Basically, we're all talking about cultural evolution, folks. Maybe we're not using the words, but that's what we're talking about. That's our common cause here. And I also want to flag this idea of a revelation, a lens, and there's so much depends upon how you look at it. And in my conversation with Bob, when he talks about his revelations, he said such things as, before I saw my employees as just employees who were there to work and to make the company produce. Then after my revelation, I saw them as like my child that I was giving away at a wedding. And that shift in perspective made all the difference, And he's saying all these business experts come to observe Barry Wehmiller, and they're all amazed, and they say, I've never seen anything like it. Literally, they were blind to it, even though actually not only do these ingredients exist with Barry Wehmiller, they're all around us. There's other successful cases. If you're not seeing it, it's not because it's not out there. It's because of that lens that you have and need to exchange with another lens. And so the concept of lenses, the concept we don't see anything except for lenses, and those lenses blind us as well as providing vision. These are all things that we can talk about and understand, basically, before we get to any formalities. But so David, you're next in seniority.
Well, I'm really the baby of the group. I've been with Barry Wehmiller for 18 months, and I came over from the United Kingdom, where I was a pastor in the Church of England. I was a vicar and leading in the church there, and I enjoyed it. Many good things about that, but I decided it was time to move on. And when I moved over here with my wife, who's from St. Louis, I kind of felt like, well, I've done the non-profit thing, I've done the virtuous thing. I'll just look for a job. I did my second master's in psychology, and I thought, well, look, if I get a job where I feel fairly compensated and I work with nice people, and every now and again they say, well done, you're doing a good job, I'll be satisfied with that. And I kind of fell into this role at Barry Wehmiller, and I've found that, well, I do feel fairly compensated, and I work with some great people, and recognition is one of the cornerstones of Barry Wehmiller. So I often feel like the things that I do are celebrated, and wouldn't you know, it also feels incredibly purposeful. And so I have that gift of being able to work in that kind of environment. And my role really centers around teaching and training, both in the business and outside, working with Brian in colleges and universities around the country and around the world, to bring this message that it is possible to have your cake and eat it. It is possible to care about people and treat them well and run a successful business or a successful organization.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Michael, you have to leave us on the half hour, so but we're really happy to have you here, if only briefly. So please introduce yourself and your connection with Barry Wehmiller and myself, for that matter.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Pirson. I'm originally from Germany, and I think I shared with you that growing up in sort of a divided country that was communist and capitalist at the time was like giving me a question about the lenses through which we look through. And I sort of took that through a very much meandering career path from nonprofits to government to for-profits to startups into academia, trying to figure out what are the lenses that are most helpful at this point. And that brought me to connect with your work through one of the giants that I had the pleasure to work with, Paul Lawrence, and also with the connection to your work and Eleanor Ostrom and E.O. Wilson. So I found that very helpful and powerful to understand humanity and human nature at a more scientific level. And help explain this kind of prosocial behavior that Barry Wehmiller found itself to be organizing for. And so what I call humanistic organizing, humanistic management is yeah, as you said, is possible and is probably potentially the standard. It's just we don't see it as such and we take it for granted when it happens. And we're not very good at maintaining it when it actually is under some threat through another lens. And so I think that's sort of the danger that we see right now. And Bob Chapman reached out at one point after he talked to Donna Hicks, as we have started to distribute what I think Bob calls the vaccine or the new lens to the next generation, in which it's like, hey, this is possible. Just if you know that this is possible, then maybe it gives you hope or it gives you choice. I think before that, for most students, thinking of what we call the economistic framework or the corporate standard model seemed to be sort of the prison. And many people are cynical. Many of the students came in cynical, maybe even already adopting that was sort of the quid pro quo. They have to accept a model where an organization and a boss doesn't care, and you sort of extract what you can. And that's very sad as a human possibility. And so I appreciate the connection with Barry Wehmiller, with Brian, with David, with Rhonda, and with you, David, to also just see what's possible as an alternative. So that's what brings me here. And that's what inspires me working with Brian and with Barry Wehmiller and the group there.
And Michael, if I can just tag on to that.
Yeah.
That's what we're experiencing when Michael and I get to be in classrooms together or separately. The number one thing we found, especially in the last year or two, is that students are hungry for this validation that there are companies that want to lead with these pro-social behaviors. The students themselves feel it's written in their mind or their heart that their lens is already there, but they're afraid they're going to have to go out into a business world, get a job, nonprofit, for-profit, government, wherever. And almost like David was just describing, all right, if it's just okay, I'll turn off the rest of myself, I'll get through the workday, and then I'll do pro-social behaviors after work. And what we, are encouraging here is, there are organizations like that out there. We'll talk about Barry Wehmiller's journey today, but there are other organizations. There's many, and we want to keep encouraging those organizations both to be humanistic and pro-social, but also to share their story so that we give encouragement and hope to the students of today.
Right. So when we look at, is it possible, and the sources of leading to that, one is examples, of course. If there's companies doing it, then it's surely possible. So you have that. You also have many spiritual traditions. I mean, Bob comes from a Christian tradition, but evidently, Rhonda, you just said that he was very free of bringing in Eastern traditions. Of course, Raj brings in the whole Indian tradition. So you have a spiritual authority for this. And then to that, I think what I bring to the table, and Michael also, well, there's the humanistic tradition, the whole tradition humanism, which is kind of like a secular religion, was always envisioned that way. And then, of course, then there's scientific authority. And in many ways, I think my contribution to this, not me, but what I represent, is a form of scientific authority. So when we ask the question, is this possible? Then all of these different forms of authority, example, religion, spirituality, and science, can be focused on a single point. They could all converge on the possibility of this, and that's very powerful indeed. And at the same time, undermine the alternative narrative, the greed is good narrative, that is, which is the dominant tradition now. It can be, it's truly a different paradigm, which is what we mean by a different paradigm. Well, let me get to this concept of structure, and one of the things that I'm amazed by with most high-performing organizations that I study is the amount of time that they spend on curating the culture. And in so many cases, you encounter business people and they're saying, I'm so busy, and we're just so busy with our short-term objectives. We don't have time for anything. We don't even have time to, give a 10-minute survey to our staff members. But somehow the high-performing companies seem to manage to do exactly that. They spend a lot of time building their cultures, which over the short term must take away from day-to-day operations, but it's worth it. It's richly worth it, or at least I think that's what you're going to say. So tell me, before we get to details of structure, how it is that you allocate time between the day-to-day operations demands of any business and the longer-term prospects of actually constructing your culture. We call that niche construction in the evolution business. But speak to me about this major point. And Rhonda, why don't you go first, and then we can just do a quick round.
Sure. I think one of the things that starts with the fallacy that you're trying to balance the two, right? So if you think about balance, if balancing your culture and your performance, balancing your people and your performance, it always implies that one is in sacrifice of the other. One's up, the other one's down. And so what we're really working hard to bring to life in Barry Wehmiller is the concept of people and performance and harmony. This understanding that an investment in your people is an investment in your performance, because everything we do happens with and through people. So we really can't perform without people being engaged and passionate. And so we try to help leaders understand that it's not like I have to make the donuts over here and then help my people over here, to try to get them to see it as this integrated process of how I inspire and support and help people grow towards their full potential, which is going to drive towards our performance. So when we think about the kind of last 5 years history of Barry Wehmiller, we recognize that, and probably Raj and Bob said this to you in the podcast, that we believe that business can be the most powerful force for good in society. And that's a lot of what Raj speaks about, right? The fact that in the history, capitalism has done more for the people of the world than any other force. And so if you believe that, then we recognize that we want to be an inspiration to other companies. You can only be an inspiration to other companies if you both take care of people and perform with excellence. And so that's really the modern history, is to be very explicit about that. Because I think in our 20-year history, Brian and I helped Bob spend 20 years trying to change how people think about leadership in business. And we expected performance, but we weren't explicit with leaders of how you do that at the same time. So that's kind of the modern journey of what we're trying to bring to life, is to help leaders understand how you integrate these ideas of delivering for customers as well as delivering for people.
And I'd bring that to life with an additional phrase. It's not about doing more, it's about doing different. So sometimes the implication is, all right, I'm going to have to work an extra hour longer so that I have time to spend on people or something. So echoing all of Rhonda's phrases, well, it's not that we make meetings 30 minutes longer so that we can do recognition and talk about our vision. It's standard practice at Barry Wehmiller to begin a meeting with a opportunity for recognition, a forum for recognition. And sometimes that's 2 minutes, sometimes that's 5, sometimes that's 10. That doesn't mean we make the meeting 10 minutes longer. It means, and this is what we actually experience, that it connects people and it allows us to be more effective with the remaining time that we have. I will never forget in early days working with Rhonda, sometimes we'd have an hour time for a meeting and we'd spend the first 20 minutes being creative and doing recognition and talking about vision, do a lot of other things. And then I swear we would get 2 hours worth of work done in the next 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Why? Because you're connected to one another. You're connected to the vision. You're in a creative, innovative space. And that's where we can experience the practical nature of that. And it's people like yourselves, Michael Pirson and David Sloan Wilson, that can help us unlock the scientific background of that, but we can see it actually working in our business.
Well, David, let me have you take your turn. And Michael, what you'd like to say, but we've touched upon one of the core design principles, which I can just introduce here, which is graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior. And let me just unpack that because you provided an example. And so basically, if we're not doing what we aspire to do, then something needs to be done about it. And there's two dimensions to that. One is if we are doing well, then that needs to be recognized. So positive, responding to positive behaviors. And if we're not doing, if things are not quite right, then there has to be some correction, but that need not be harsh or mean-spirited. It can be friendly and escalate only when necessary. And then when I put that to Bob and Raj, I think Bob mentioned a 5-to-1 ratio that basically we should spend 5 times as much time praising good behavior and to every unit of correcting inappropriate behavior. So actually, let me ask you to reflect upon that, starting with you, David, and then the structure that's required for that, because you already said aspiration's not enough. Aspirations is just a tornado without structure. And so what's the structure that actually implements a 5-to-1 ratio, if that's what you've decided upon?
Well, I think the core of it in Barry Wehmiller is about empowering people, giving them responsibility to be able to do that graduated responding. So I would suggest that a lot of firms, what they think about is, well, if someone really messes up, we have to have legal policies in place to end their employment. And that's kind of the scope of the thinking. But of course, that's not graduated, and they're not thinking about the positive side of the equation, which I would say is more powerful. And so we have kind of structured programs, which, if obviously we have that legal framework in place if someone's not performing, but we also have structured programs which are really good and that we put a lot of time and energy into for celebrating, recognizing people. We have awards that might be given to someone once in their whole career, perhaps just a few people get them. Then other things that maybe every couple of years they would get official kind of recognition, and it goes through our it's called Workday, our employment IT system. All of that, I think the power of it is it kind of sets the standard. It's like the flag out the front. And the real effect is that it creates a culture where people do this organically between one another. And so we, as Brian's alluded to already, at the start of many meetings, I'd say most kind of formal, regular meetings, we will have 10 minutes and anyone can just give recognition to each other. We have cards that people can write on, just give them to appear. We encourage people just to celebrate each other. And so that makes it really graduated. When it's the kind of environment where it feels okay and it feels safe and it's really welcome to be able to say to someone, hey, look, I really appreciate what you did for me the other day. It means that it goes all the way up from just a little bit of extra work all the way to the extended effort. And we do teach on the other side on feedback. We give significant time to telling people, well, look, giving people feedback in an informal, semi-formal way about something to help them. It's a gift to them. It's not, you're not being harsh, you're not being unfair. So that, again, you have that graduate. If someone just needs some advice and needs some redirection, they can do that informally without going through some kind of formal procedure.
Okay, that's on with if things aren't going right, something needs to be corrected, then it starts that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Rhonda and Brian, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, a few thoughts that come to mind. The first is that, and I know we want to wander into talking about what we've learned through all these 140 acquisitions. And I would tell you that one thing that I've learned when you get a chance to go in and try to transform culture again and again is that almost every single person shows up and they want to do a good job every day. And so if somebody is letting us down, the first person to point the finger at is us. because what we've learned, and I could tell story after story of people who we thought they were problems, we thought they were lazy, we thought they weren't doing their job. And when you find out, the problem was the system that we set up, the way we were treating them, our leadership, right? And so I think what we've learned again and again and again is first start with the system and the leadership processes. When something's going wrong, it's probably us. It's probably not the person.
Let me just bookmark that. But basically, systemic.
Yep.
That we're not being reductionistic here. If a problem is manifesting in the behavior of an individual, then it's not the individual that you need to fix. It's the system. They're a node in a system. And so that systemic thinking, I think, is something which is so important to emphasize that you've converged upon in your own way. And which is also something that's very general, is that just, I mean, everything is a complex system. An individual person is a complex system before you even get to the organization of such complex systems. So and that makes every case unique also. So even though they're products of general principles. Let me get to first, Michael, a few minutes before you have to leave, if you could provide a final reflection, just let us know when that is. Is that now, or can you stay on a few?
Yeah, that should be now. I think I need to, unfortunately, go to a meeting from my bosses. Place for one of those interesting personnel meeting questions that, Rhonda, you're sort of putting in place, because in many organizations, it's not set up the way that you are describing. And in fact, mostly what's happening is you're getting punished for when something doesn't work, right? And so I think that may be also my last observation, David, is like the power of just knowing that you're trusted to do the right thing. And that, yes, you can screw up too. And that seems so simple, but it's not the experience that most people have at organizations, right? And so even in my university, I teach this, but it's not, I cannot witness it. I cannot witness it. It's even with our students. I mean, we try to do that. We try to encourage students, but they're afraid through whatever the experience that they've had in the school system, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that fear, and you say it's a system, it's the creation of that system of love and care. Bob doesn't use the word love, but he means it.
Yeah, why doesn't he use the word love? He said that, and that really struck me. He says he used the word care, not love. Why does he not use the word love?
I think he works to be more accessible to people. And so I feel like he has people who have a reaction to the word love. It's, we're in manufacturing, we make machines that, huge machines that make toilet paper and corrugated board. And so I feel like he decided that the word care was more accessible to people, because that many people in our organization he'd start with creating friction when he talked about love. So he chose care.
And an add-on question. He's a Christian, but I don't think he insists upon that, right? So and of course worldwide, how could you? So there's some sense in which the values that he has gotten through his own Christian tradition, he's sort of generalized and distilled it so that it could be presented to others in a way which is more expansive than that. Is that safe to say? And do you have conversations along those lines?
Yeah, and Brian and I watched him go through that, right? We watched him go through, early days when it was just a few of us starting this journey. One of our colleagues said to him, Bob, do you think less of me because I'm not a religious person? And so I think he talks a lot about listening, and sometimes he's really good at it. And so I think just...
I know his type, by the way. My father was his type. So that listening part.
But I do think just that absorbing that from people and understanding how he wasn't creating what he intended to create. And so making adjustments, understanding that we do have hundreds of people in our company in India and in China. And so to try to make it more accessible so that we can bring more people into the tent. And so I think it's been interesting for Brian and I. We watched him learn those lessons and adjust his style through the past 20 years.
Well, the Dalai Lama has a book titled Beyond Religion, Towards an Ethics for the Whole World. And so, his point is there's 8 billion people on this planet, and there's no way they're all going to have the same religion. So how do we proceed from there? And so he distilled a set of ethical principles that he called Beyond Religion. Ryan.
Well, and that's the key part is we frequently get the question, well, but wait, this works in North America or this works in the Midwest. Does it really work across cultures? And yes, that's our lived experience. When we do an acquisition, when we do an adoption in India, in China, in France, Italy, wherever, our most growing operation right now is in Serbia. And it's phenomenal, regardless of faith background or no faith, regardless of national background or whether nation is not as important to you. What we found is that what's written on people's heart are some core principles about how we want to treat one another and how we want to act together. And David, that's where I thank you for pulling together those 8 pro-social principles. You know, we wrote down our guiding principles of leadership. And we have found in lived experience that those are applicable everywhere. Regardless of any divides that we historically have in our world today, they work everywhere. And that's what I think is so exciting here is it's accessible to everyone. And that's been a key focus of us more recently is making sure that we take this message and we make it accessible, removing some religious language and adding languages from different parts of the world and different backgrounds.
Yeah, so we're quickly going to get to what I think is the most amazing part of this conversation and what you've done, which is these over 140 adoptions. I want to remain within the parent organization. I keep wanting to say mother organization, and then I correct myself and say parent organization because men and women are both involved and should be equally parental. But I wanted to focus on one other courtesan principle within Barry Wehmiller, and that's conflict resolution and fast and inclusive conflict resolution. And when I put that to Bob, he said, well, I don't see much conflict. There isn't much. And now I think I'm now going to the structure people.
It stops here.
The same question. Maybe begin with David and then go in reverse seniority order as to, I want to say, really? Is that possible? So how do you, what is the structure that you built around conflict resolution, starting with you, David?
So one of the, the core thing that we teach on is listening, and we do that all the way around the world. In the last year or so, we've trained almost all of our leaders, and by the end of the next financial year, all of our leaders will have had a really core 2-day class in listening and communication skills. And listening, as we teach that, it's fundamental to everything we do. But as we teach listening, we then teach how it lays into conflict. And so we say to people, well, it's important to be able to express yourself clearly in conflict. But the more important thing is then to be able to listen to people. And this is a mind-blowing skill to people. It was really useful to me, even coming from a pastoral background as I do this, because whenever you confront someone with something, you're always going to unsettle them. You're going to make them feel we call it in the box. You're going to put them out a little bit. They're going to feel emotional. And people think that confrontation or conflict or expressing yourself, you put it out there and you say it clearly and then it's done. And actually, listening is the groundwork which enables that to reach a positive solution that then both people need to communicate and listen well to each other, particularly the person who's coming with the problem, in order that you can build some kind of new reality out of what previously was a conflict situation.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Definitely. I think one of the biggest things about conflict is it changes when we see the humanity in the person across the table from us. And so going back to that idea of a lens, when we see everyone as someone's precious child, that includes people that we might have conflict with. We're going to have conflict. We have conflict inside the organization with vendors, with customers, with others along the way. And one of the things that we experience is conversations with workers' councils and unions, which historically for some businesses can be very contentious and have a lot of conflict. And I'll never forget early in my tenure at Barry Wehmiller, the first 10 years, we had a very senior leader that I have the utmost respect for, who was in the middle of a union negotiation. It had just been traditional that HR on our side and union representation just would kind of yell at one another and they'd, make accusations of different things. And he just kind of put his hand up and said, this is not how this meeting is going to continue. We're going to take a moment to pause. We're going to come back and recognize that there's value in both of our positions, and we're going to speak with decorum and honor of each of us. Doesn't mean we have to agree, but we're not going to yell and scream and point fingers and accuse either direction. And I think that was a big touch point embodied by one of our senior leaders that, all right, what has historically been areas of conflict, whether that's in a home, whether that's, you know, union versus management, whether that's higher versus lower, whatever divides that we have, we can change that and work towards the resolution. And maybe just briefly, the other thing I would share is something that's somewhat unique about Barry Wehmiller's business is we create large pieces of equipment and other technical solutions that often last for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So when we engage in selling a piece of machinery or a solution to somebody, we expect to be in a long-term relationship with that organization. And that also changes the mindset that conflicts are going to come up in that 30, 40, 50 years, but we're committed to working through it and finding a way to continue to be in a productive relationship together. And I think
That's
that's given
very,
us an
very
opportunity.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, is that there's something actually about the nature of the business that is predicated on long-term relationships. I think that's a new insight for me. Rhonda.
One thing that's interesting to me, having been here for so long, is to understand the perspectives of new people that come in. And what's happened to us in the past few years is that quite intentionally, we've been attracting new talent to the organization who've come from high-performing peer companies or similar companies like GE, Danaher, Rexnord. And so I always ask for their reflections as they come in. And we had a woman named Kelly Morgano who joined us. And she actually joined a business review where we come in and the business presents their numbers and we talk about that and challenge that and those kinds of things. And she joined us before she actually even had her first day in the organization. And what she said to me immediately was, the way you talk to each other is so different than what I've experienced. She said just the tone of the challenge is there, but it's completely respectful. It's collaborative. It's generous, right? So I think that there's also kind of a byproduct of this 20 years of transformation is that, like Brian said, if it started in a union relationship, and Bob Chapman, his style would be to step back and say, unions exist because people needed them, right? People needed to be protected from their companies. We don't want to be that kind of company that people need protection from, but we can be respectful and have respectful relationships with union leaders and respect their role. And so our biggest union facility is, we have the UAW union in Green Bay, and it has been just such a collaborative partnership in terms of, even in the 08-09 downturn, which is kind of one of the places where we really solidified our culture.
Yeah, right.
We made concessions and the union agreed to those concessions with us. They said, we'll be with you, right? And so I think it's just, there's a tone of positivity that started with, that's the optimistic person that Bob Chapman is, that's then been reinforced through the process that we put in place. I think about, why is recognition and celebration so important? And you'll hear Bob say this all the time, is that you fill your airwaves with the good things that are going on, and it sort of crowds out all the negativity and gossip and those kinds of things. So why I start with recognition and celebration is to remind us that we're probably having a meeting because we have a problem or something that needs to be solved. But let's start by thinking about everything that went right. And sometimes it's in the manufacturing environment, everything that went right since yesterday. And then let's dig into the things that we can fix. And then when we fix those, we'll celebrate those tomorrow.
Wow, it's just so amazing. David.
And the explicit thing that we teach is acceptance without agreement. You don't have to agree with someone to accept them. This is implicit in what Rhonda and Brian were saying. That relates to one of the other core design principles, which is collaboration. Well, it's somewhat easy most of the time to collaborate with someone that you agree with, but one of the key things that we communicate to everyone in the organization is, hey, you can collaborate with someone without necessarily agreeing with them.
Yeah. So one final thing about conflict resolution before we proceed to the main event. If you didn't think this was the main event before, you will soon. And that is, I think that Bob mentioned something called mind the gap, in which one reason that conflicts don't exist is actually they do exist, but they're addressed very, very early. And you have a specific structure called mind the gap, that is built around that. So could you elaborate on that? Anyone who likes to begin?
So I think it's part of the listening process, and it really goes straight into talking about those adoptions or acquisitions. Is that we paint a very positive picture about what it's supposed to look. We set a big expectation about what it's supposed to be like to work at Barry Wehmiller, and it's virtually impossible for us to live up to that expectation. And so we have conversations and say, if this is what we believe we should be as an organization, what's different than that today? And let's challenge ourselves to close those gaps. So there's a process of not just formal ways, like we did an Every Voice Matters survey last year, where we engaged our organization in a more formal feedback way, but then following that up with listening sessions and understanding what people are experiencing that's different than who we say we want to be, and then figuring out, well, what do we have to change to close that gap? And so that's just a constant process, because every single day we wake up and somewhere in the corner of this global 13,000 person organization, we have failed someone, right? Our culture is how we treated somebody at the edge of the organization on the worst day. And so, so every day there's a gap that we can close, and we just have to wake up and have that continuous improvement mindset to say, let's find those gaps and close them.
Yeah, so this brings up a whole dimension. There's so much to talk about that there's no way to cover everything. But we spend a lot of time on the core design principles. Of equal importance is this concept of adaptability, that the successful organization must first of all be well governed in the present, but also must be capable of changing to adapt to the future. And that's what you just addressed there, Ron, is that basically all the time you're identifying gaps and you're saying, what could we do? That has to be some kind of experimental procedure. That's to say, what can we do? We got to try stuff out. We have to imagine alternatives. We have to try stuff out. We have to see what works. If it works, we have to replicate it. We need to know it's probably is context sensitive. So much as I want to get to our many adoptions, a little bit more about this evolutionary procedure, experimental procedure, whereby you recognize the need for change and then set about doing it at scales evidently small and large.
I think this has been inherent to the Barry Wehmiller culture since even before I joined. This acknowledgement from Bob and leaders like Rhonda that, hey, there's going to be gaps. Let's look at how we close those along the way, and let's look at it in a creative fashion. That's something that I've taken from Bob directly is, don't just try to do what some other company did or what you read about in a book somewhere. Be open to new, innovative solutions. And eventually in our journey, and I had the honor to be part of this, was focusing more on the tools of continuous improvement, Lean, Six Sigma. They go by lots of different names, and I could list all the different tools out to you. But at the core of all of them is to get people together with diverse perspectives, listen to each other, and be open and creative about the thought process of potential responses. And so at this point, that's happening probably 50 times in this one location alone in a given day, with little ideas and little things. As they get larger, as the problems or opportunities get larger, then we put more structure around them. But I would hope, and I'd be interested to see if David will opine on this, I would hope that someone would learn very quickly in Barry Wehmiller, both formally and informally, hey, if you've got an idea, share it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be implemented 100% of the time. Maybe we tried it 5 years ago. Maybe it's time to try it again. But this openness to hear those ideas, because that's what I experienced from Rhonda throughout my tenure, is if I had an idea, she would always listen. And sometimes it was a chance for coaching. Brian, this is why we're not going to go in that direction. And other times it was, well, hey, let's see if this idea has some legs along the way.
Okay,
Well,
so go ahead, David.
Well, I actually think this is part of the Barry Wehmiller journey that we don't say as much about, but it's really important that I think as I read and think about the core design principles, what Eleanor Ostrom was kind of saying was she was speaking against that Hobbesian perspective that if you leave people to their own devices, they'll just be in constant conflict with each other, and you need some kind of strong man at the top. You know, Thomas Hobbes was writing around the English Civil War, and he saw all the chaos of the monarchy being established and people being really horrendous to each other. He's like, well, you just need to have someone who's going to lay down the law. And Eleanor Ostrom, in her work, he's looking at these communities saying, no, that's not necessarily true. People have it within themselves to self-organize in ways that are productive and pro-social and lead to good outcomes in the world. And that's that's implicitly what we communicate through the Lean Six Sigma journeys that Brian's been talking about. That's so
Yeah, if I could
important.
just interject, David,
Yeah,
for just
please.
a minute,
Yeah.
that the many positive examples that are out there. And now we're talking about all these methods, Lean, Six Sigma, Agile. Things evolve because they work at some scale. They're given labels, and there's a lot of redundancy. In other words, convergence. Because there are actually certain ingredients that are required for things to work, and they get reinvented again and again and again, different names. And on the one hand, we'd like to distill out the common denominators. Wouldn't that be nice? But on the other hand, it means there's so much out there that we can select from that we don't have to invent, because it was invented by somebody else. We just have to learn how to see it, back to the lens, for what it is. So it's really nice that you basically you recognize the tools are out there, hiding in plain sight, you might say, and then we can adopt them and we can see just which ones work for ourselves, and so on and so forth. So please continue.
Well, I think, and I'd love Rhonda and Brian's perspective on this, but it seems to me that where we've been, one of the keys to our success in our adoptions is that very often, particularly in the early days of our organization, we would be adopting companies that were not doing well financially. And in those environments, one of the things that was eroded, first of all, was trust. So trust from the leaders of the organization to the people in the business. They weren't healthy cultures because trust had been eroded. And so when we adopted them and went through this process of saying, well, what are your ideas? Please share them. Please help us to grow the business. And gave people that responsible freedom, it opened up a new world of collaboration and interaction and positive energy that allowed those organizations then to flourish under our care.
Yeah, Bob put it, it's like feeding candy to a child. And we'll get to that. I have one more question about Barry Wehmiller before we proceed to its many adoptions. How much time do you spend screening new employees? Do you spend a lot of time just finding the best fit, or in fact, are you more open? And there are other companies that are completely open, actually, and then you expect the culture change to take place after the person comes into the organization. So the initial screening process, what's the structure that you've built around that? What's your philosophy about that?
I would say that the bigger your span of impact in the organization, the more people that you have in your span of care, the higher the bar is to join the organization. Because, if you have a leader at a senior level that has a lot of people in their span of care, we make a mistake with that. I mean, everything about the culture you experience through your leader. And if I am experiencing a great culture over here with my leader, and the one next to me, their team isn't experiencing it, it's even worse than if everybody was just in a bad culture. So at the most senior levels, it is really a gauntlet to get hired at Barry Wehmiller. And
but you said, Rhonda, that you bring in people from other companies that have very different cultures, and so whatever screening.
It's people who are naturally aligned. And so, first of all, they take the call because they probably never heard of Barry Wehmiller, right? And so they take the call
because the screening process, just the fact that they're doing it is a screening.
But we actually use an assessment where we assess both cognitive ability and cultural fit. So we have a formal assessment. At the most senior level, you would go through 4 hours of assessment and also an interview. And then we also have them present a case interview. And we expose senior leaders who are coming to this organization with so much information about the company. And then they reflect back to us of how they would take on the task of whatever the role is that we're offering them. And so, but it's actually for them too. I mean, if we make a mistake, it's painful,
mistake too.
right? It takes a long time, but for them, I mean, you make a mistake in your career, right? That's very difficult. So I think for us, it's just exposing people to what the role really is, exposing them to a lot of leaders in the organization, and so that they really understand the choice that they're making, and so do we. So I would say at the senior most levels, at the entry level of the organization, in many cases, especially in manufacturing, if you look at manufacturing in Europe and the US especially, there aren't as many people coming in. So I think that's an opportunity to allow people. We look for people who want to drive continuous improvement. So if we think about, we have a set of expectations for team members, and one of them is to be able to drive continuous improvement at every level. There's some people who just want to come in and they just want to do their job, right? They don't want to improve anything they don't want to think. And so those people probably more get screened out at the entry level, especially in manufacturing. And we have a set of expectations, but I think they're natural expectations that most people, you know how to treat people, right? Most of us just think that that doesn't apply in business. So it's just helping people understand that the expectations that you would have with your neighbors and your friends and your family, we have those same expectations of you here.
Well, you have this wonderful bus metaphor. The bus keeps coming around, and then if you're not ready to go on the bus, then the bus will come around. It's kind of a profound patience, I think, is what. Well, this segues directly now. We're going to get to the main event, which is it's one thing for a company to be amazing like this. It's another thing for them to accomplish the same transformation roughly again and again. In your case, 140 times, over 140 times, almost without exception around the world. And so this, whatever is going on here is pretty close to culturally universal. This is what the world really needs to know about. And this extends far, far beyond the business world. If this is possible, this kind of cultural transformation is possible, and is that replicable. The whole world needs to know about this in all context, business and every other context of our lives. And so just speak to me about, in your own words, don't try to fit it into a framework, as to your whole, everything you do with respect to acquiring, you like to call adopting other companies, why you do this, how it fits within the business plan. Are you building a supply chain around yourself? Are you expanding in that direction? Just tell me, and let's do it again in turn, in order of seniority again, Rhonda, Brian, and David, as to just tell us in your own words about this amazing thing you've done with the over 140 adoptions.
So I would say that if you read Everybody Matters, you know that Bob went through a very traumatic experience in his early leadership days. After his dad suddenly died, he found himself unexpectedly and almost unwillingly leading Barry Wehmiller. And he talks about that it seemed like everything he touched turned to gold, but everything he touched turned into issues eventually. And so when he reset to build a business that was more balanced, that could sustain the economic and market shifts that were going to come, he started to do that through acquisition. So I would say early days, it was looking for companies that would build out sort of a more balanced, that touched different markets, products, technologies, and to build a more balanced business. And if you think about when we started this acquisition journey in the early 90s, no one wanted manufacturing companies in the US. I mean, we had companies that he started by building long-term relationships with privately held companies that were perhaps like in the third generation, and then in some cases they went through a traumatic event and they called and said, we need you to bail us out. In other cases, we bought one really successful, thriving company today on the courthouse steps. Like nobody wanted it. Now today, there's tons of private equity in our space and it's much more difficult to acquire. But so in the early days, it was not about cultural transformation. It was about business transformation. But it so happened that as the acquisition journey started to accelerate and we were starting to realize things about culture, it gave us this really interesting experiment lab, because you say, okay, it worked here. That's interesting. And then you think, okay, let's try it again. Oh, it worked there too. And you start to learn these kind of fundamental lessons that everybody wants to do a good job. And
back to adaptability, by the way.
Yeah,
back to adaptability.
Yeah.
Keep going.
And so we just started to learn about our cultural model was able to be developed because we had, and then we're going to go and bring a group of people together. We had just started to become an international company. So we said, oh, let's bring a group of people together and ask them how these guiding principles reflect to them, right? And so I think it was just, for us, it was in the early days very interesting. And the model was very much about putting together a group of businesses that were complementary, that we would never experience the trauma that Bob experienced in the 80s. And why that's important is we talk about—
Rhonda, if you don't mind, by complementary, do you mean a diverse portfolio, that if the market for one goes up, another goes down? So you're not actually building a supply chain in a sense, almost the opposite, that you're—
We are. We are. So, but early days, but there was, Bob would have said that it was like, there's value levers that we had in the organization. So we weren't just looking for any business, but we were looking for a set of businesses that, that we understood how we could create value in those businesses, that our business model and the value levers that were established by Bob, would apply. And so early days, it was really about building a diverse packaging machinery company. And of those acquisitions, I'm going to guess the first 50 were packaging companies. But then someone challenged Bob and said, hey, here's a business that's for sale in Phillips, Wisconsin, and I think you'll like it. It has the same fundamentals. And they're like, oh, no, we're packaging guys. But then they went and looked at the business and they said, no, we know how to add value in this business. And so that was one thing. It wasn't just any business, but businesses where we felt we could add value. And so fundamentally, the core of our business started with capital equipment manufacturing. So machines that make consumer products for the most part. So we make machines that make bathroom tissue, and machines that make corrugated board, and machines that put the lid on a beer can. But there's a fundamental to, as Brian mentioned earlier, longer term customer relationships, which mean there's an aftermarket of sales and service that we are very, very good at taking care of those customers. And so today, about a third of our business is that kind of capital equipment. About a third of it is the parts and service that serve that capital equipment. And a third is kind of high-end professional services. So we have an engineering consulting business where I started, where we would go in and build a complete Blue Buffalo dog food plant or support an Intel plant. And then we also have an insurance services business, which is a little bit of a odd duck because that's where Kyle Chapman, Bob's son, came from. And so we have a big insurance services business as well. And today I would say we started with acquisitions that were really about driving value, and we transformed culture. And that's one of the things that Raj was so fascinated with, because he said, when he wrote Conscious Capitalism, he said most conscious companies are founded that way. He said he'd never seen one that had actually transformed into a conscious company. So if you think about the ultimate purpose of a Container Store or Whole Foods, or some of the stories I talk about in Conscious Capitalism, they were founded that way. So I think the fact that you can transform, which is what was so inspiring to him.
I mean, there's path dependency. I mean, in so many other contexts, getting from here to there is like so hard. So take me through an actual example of what you do, a signal example or general protocol. And either one, any one of the three of you are welcome to do that. What actually happens in a particular case?
So in early days, and I'll talk a little bit how it's different now, but in early days, say we acquired paper converting machine company in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Third generation family, and the people who worked there loved their family, but unfortunately they sort of got into trouble with some business decisions. And Bob had been talking to them for a while about a potential acquisition, but they actually had a product liability judgment that went against them, and it was at a time when they had consumed a lot of cash. They actually had lost, I think, 26 million on 200 million in revenues the year before we bought them. They made 25 million on 200 million in revenues the year after we bought them. And so we acquired that business. And the first thing that we would do is go in and start to build trust. And so just start with listening sessions and talking to people about what we believe and how we were going to transform the business. So this is a business that's failing. And so Bob goes in and he's listening to people. And some of the interesting things that happen is someone said, are you going to protect our union? And Bob said, I don't give a shit about your union. I care about you. He said, if you feel you need the union to be a partner and take care of it, hopefully we're going to be a company that you don't feel that you need it. Right. So a lady said to him, well, you guys probably outsource payroll. I am a payroll person. What, do I have a future here? And he said, well, we need to reinvent this company, and you might need to reinvent yourself. So maybe you're going to be something different than a payroll person. Right. So it started with just going in and establishing a kind of a fundamental trust with people, and recognizing that no one can be part of that journey forward if they don't feel they have the security.
So let me bookmark that. Basically, and this, you describe this as your own experience. That the assumption is that a given staff person is flexible enough to be doing something different, and so as long as they're performing in some general sense, they're unlikely to be fired. But they might be asked to do something different than their current job description.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, and I think that's the only way a business or a company survives, but they can only do that if they, and Michael talked about it a little bit, if they feel a sense of trust, right? Because if you want to build a flexible business that can respond to anything that's coming at you, you need flexible people. Flexible people, you have to take a risk. I'm really good at doing this, but now you need me to do this, right? And I might make a mistake and then I might get fired. So you have to build a high degree of trust, and so that people can be flexible, so that your business can be flexible.
Okay. Okay, great. So I think let's have some other examples. Brian and David, do you have actually examples that come to mind? I think that adds a concrete element to our conversation, which is very useful.
I mean, there's so many different examples. I'll pick the example of our French operations, where there's classically this assumption from some American businesses of, oh, there's such a different legal framework in France. How is this all going to work, and how's it going to come together? And Bob tells the story. And first of all, again, to not repeat, but build on what Rhonda was saying, is Bob traveled there personally. The senior leadership team traveled there personally. We had listening sessions. We share our vision. We lead with that along the way. And then someone from the Workers' Council, stood up after meeting Bob, after having a conversation, after being listened to, and said, Bob, we've been waiting for you for 30 years to come and be part of this business. And so I can tell you, definitely in manufacturing, definitely in insurance services and professional services, we continue to find places where the people are there and they're capable and they're ready to go, but they feel stifled either by their direct leadership or by the system of the organization that they're in. And if we can invite people to a different experience, an experience that's more trusting, an experience that's a little bit more transparent, that's one thing I'll add. We share a lot of information with people. There's rarely a secret in Barry Wehmiller, because we like to share what's going on. When that's good, we share it positively. We talked about recognition. And when the business is struggling a little bit, people know that in the business so that they can make small improvements and help in their area along the way. We are very transparent, more so than any other business prior to a Barry Wehmiller adoption. And then there's the chance to actually be part of it. And so, yes, we've experienced people in France. I work with several of them who said, oh, okay, this is different than what I had before. So I'm going to have to change my mindset a little bit, but I like it. I like that it's going to be here. And maybe that's the other thing I'll underline, is this commitment to longevity. Barry Wehmiller is not about purchasing a business, extracting as much value as quickly as we can, and then spitting it out the other end and moving on to something else. When you join us, you join our family. And that's why we like the term adoption. I think what's inherent in that word to us is an adoption means you're not just somebody sitting over there, you're joining our family. You're becoming part of something that you're going to be a part of for the long term. And that's a key part of it, that, hey, we intend to be around a long time with any business organization. So buy into it now, or the safe bus will come around next year or two, if that's when you want to jump on and be fully enthused. But come join us, because we're going to be here for you to join.
Well, let me point to two forms of cultural variation that you are evidently able to overcome, because the idea that this works in all cultures is, once again, extraordinary. And two kind of cultural variants, you might say, are in some of the Eastern European countries. I mean, deep mistrust. If you look at the history of the nations, they've just been conquered again and again and again. And so it's almost bred into the bone of distrust.
Super interesting story about that, David. So
all right, go ahead,
one of our more recent acquisitions is in Serbia. And they just told me last time I was visiting there that they had some kind of they used to have these some kind of company competition where you could go and compete and represent your company from anything from swimming or anything else. And the leader there told me that it has a very communist kind of connotation to it. And so he was so proud. He said, we had 190 people from the company sign up to go and compete in sport representing our company there called Stacks, right? So it's kind of, if you think about that, are you even able to overcome some of that history politically. And they said they were shocked and so proud that people wanted to represent the company.
Okay, so basically you did succeed. Did you have to do anything different to succeed, or was just your general protocol sufficient, even in this case where your starting point is deeply, deeply culturally embedded distrust?
Well, so just to kind of step back a little bit about where we are on this adoption journey. So in the early days, Bob, he had turned a company around that was failing. And so what he said is, I know how to add value to a failing company. Right. So we only bought failing companies in the early days because he said, why would I buy a successful company? What am I going to do to that company to make it better, add value to it? And so more recently, we have bought companies that are succeeding and that had, and you know what, when a company's failing, typically the culture is not good, right? Because people they can't trust, and there's a lot going on there. But we've bought companies that had okay cultures and that were succeeding, maybe even financially, percentages wise, more successful than we were. And the thing that's been amazing to see in the modern journey is that we are able to unleash the growth of those organizations, and not just by cash. So somehow there's something about infusing this culture into a successful company that unleashes even more success than what they were having. And so that's fascinating. And so today, most of our acquisitions are successful companies. And that company in Serbia, the example is that they were succeeding. They had a great niche in making the packaging equipment for tissue. And it was a great add to our what we already had, our product line that we already had at the right price point. And they had someone in there kind of managing the deal. And he said to us, this is the first time I've ever sold a company to the lowest bidder. So the leadership, the ownership of this company so wanted to be part of the culture that we've created, that he took much, much less than what others had offered, because he didn't want to go into kind of being part of that cutthroat private equity environment or other environments that he saw. And so we see that again and again and again, that we build long-term relationships with companies that we think would be a good fit. And then over time, they become to trust us. And we typically don't have to pay the top dollar. And then we also form a partnership. And so typically what happens is that because of the success, the owners of those companies do much, much better than they would have done at the outset, because we say, join us and then participate in the further success of your organization. So it's been just really fun to watch, it's been a long journey, right? So from 30 years ago, transforming culture where people had terrible cultures to unleashing the potential of companies that the culture is pretty good and the leaders believe what we believe. And somehow it's just this process that we go through, and the business strategy that we go through that unleashes it.
Well, and this brings me back to Bob's earlier experience where he said, prior to his revelations, I was a good guy and I was running a good company. And then, this further unleashing took place. David, go ahead. And then I'm going to ask about another major cultural variation.
Well, my experience, as I said earlier, I was a pastor in the church, and that gave me a window on how difficult change is. One of the quotes I like is Mark Twain said, "The only person who likes change is a wet baby." And in the church, you get to experience that in the sense that obviously it's got this long tradition, but many churches, at least in England and North America, are declining, and so it's right for them to have some kind of change. But can you get people to want, you say to people, well, I want change. Yeah, great. Do you want to change? And people say, no way. And you can run into all this resistance when you try and introduce something. Well, why don't we, adapt this to make it more welcoming to new people? And people find it really difficult. But from my perspective, I'd say that one of the reasons why we're able to bring this adaptable culture in Barry Wehmiller is that first core design principle of a shared sense of purpose. And we talk very explicitly about the fact that the reason that we want to succeed as a business is so that people can feel safe in their jobs and be able to provide for their families. And that really hits home. You think about a place like our facility in Phillips, Wisconsin, which is a small town, and the Barry Wehmiller facility is by far the biggest employer for tens, maybe hundreds of miles around. People drive for an hour to get there to work. And there was a time when it was looking like this was one of our early adoptions that Rhonda was speaking about, and it looked like the future of that company was in peril. And people in that town saw the perspective, the possibility of this factory going under and what it would mean for the economics of that local area. And we came in and we said to people, well, we care about you, we care about your future, we care about your families. And so that change, everyone cares about that for themselves, but there's kind of an expectation that your company just cares about making a profit. And to have a company that says, no, we care about you, means that when we say, hey, look, we're going to bring these changes, from my perspective, I think it makes people way more open to adapt and to try new things. Not that it's always easy. Some people still do take a while to come around to it, but it's an order of magnitude easier to increase that adaptability.
Well, I was going to talk, and I will. This is an amazing conversation. I'm so happy to have it recorded. But I was going to talk about like the Asian Western cultural difference, but based on what you just said, David, I also want to bring in the huge cultural divide that exists within the United States that we're currently experiencing as a political divide. Often it's an urban-rural distinction, we think. I mean, we know that just in terms of electoral politics. And you just said, you're operating in the Midwest, a lot of it. So basically what you do bridges the urban-rural divide, and therefore the political chasm which exists in America and many other places at this moment. So speak to me about how you're able to bridge even this divide, which is, of course, so momentous in terms of our current cultural moment.
Yeah, I think if I could tell you that we have that solved, if I had some kind of a magic bullet, and that if I understood exactly how people are feeling and the divisiveness that is existing inside of our plants today, I think this podcast would be very popular. So I would say, generally, with the positive communication and listening and having people focus on what's going right as opposed to always what's going wrong, that we maybe are in a better position than most. But I know that there are that political divide that exists in this country certainly exists within teams and cultures, and hopefully in the most case that we keep it from entering and sort of poisoning our work culture. But I can't say that any company in the US could be, if they were confident that they had that solved, I think they wouldn't be being honest with themselves.
Well, I think, yeah, first of all, you're right. But secondly, I think at the root of both positions, including the conservative position, is a deep feeling of community, and the feeling that that's lost. They're trying to regain it in their own way. And so that if you actually do provide community, it's really striking at the heart of both positions. There, I think that there's quite a reasonable, not overly optimistic, and it all comes back to trust in community again, one more time. So,
and
Brian?
David, if there's perhaps a small nugget there. One of the things that we talk really meaningfully about, and it comes from a variety of cultural and religious traditions as well, is people want to be part of doing something meaningful. They want to be part of meaningful work and have a valuable contribution. And I think that's at least a piece when people feel that they are part of a team where their contribution is valued and they're doing something meaningful in the world. It helps them, it helps me look beyond any political or ideological differences and things like that. So I'm not saying that's the complete solution, but I do think it helps when I feel like I'm part of something valuable on a team. And I work with David and Rhonda quite frequently. I don't know how they're voting, coming up or what that all looks like, but I feel committed to the vision and the work that we have to do. And I'm willing to work arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with people of different ideological backgrounds to get this valuable work done. And I think that's at least a piece of it.
Yeah. So basically that's CDP1, back again, sense of purpose and meaning. And then CDP 2 through 6 is structure. So, and I think, we've already said, you can't just have a tornado, or you can't just have, even if it's a good tornado, that we have a strong sense of purpose. No, there has to be structure. And then that structure has to extend beyond the organization, the single organization. It has to extend to your relationship with other organizations. That's where CDP 7 and 8 come in. Well, we're entering our final segment here, but David, you're up next, and also I do want to talk about the Asian-Western difference, if only briefly. So David.
Well, I'll say we talk about business being the most powerful force for good in the world, and that can sound a bit overblown, particularly when I was in church. I'd have said, no, that's ridiculous. We're the non-profits, religious organizations, we're the ones that are making a difference. And anyone in business, they've just sold out. They're in it for extracting as much out of the world as possible and making a buck while they do it. But honestly, that one of the interesting things about CDP1 is this sense of a common identity, and there are many organizations that exist today that build their identity on othering another group, or we are not another group, and sadly the church is part of that. Brian and Rhonda are Catholics, and I'm an Episcopalian, and we get on pretty well together. But if it had been like 500 years ago, we'd have been killing each other over our religious differences of transubstantiation and the virgin birth and all that kind of thing. So, and in politics and in the media and in social media, people benefit from building identity around saying, well, I am not this thing, we are not this thing, and this other thing is bad. In business, we don't have the luxury of doing that. As Brian said, actually, we have to build our identity about getting something done and achieving some end result. And so I have hope that actually business is able to cross that divide, because our incentives are in getting along together despite our disagreements.
Yeah, well, business plus more. I mean, there'll always be things other than businesses, but and a point I wanted to make earlier, when we talk about all of the pathologies of business as usual and neoclassical economics and so on, it's shocking to realize that that's also true of our educational system. And our educational system, the way we try to educate our children, is also a treadmill of individual level competition and so on and so forth. And so this is just seeped out into every aspect of culture. And of course, Bob says all the time that what he does in the workplace spreads to the health, to the families, to the spousal relationships, and so on and so forth. And so business plus more always will it be business plus more as forces for good. Well, let's say a little bit at least about the Asian-Western difference, which is a major cultural difference. They're really quite, if we speak in biological terms, they have different anatomies and physiologies. We talk about a kind of a reductionistic view versus a holistic view. Also, so many cultures are very deeply hierarchical, and to go against that would be just to be disorienting almost. And yet, nevertheless, you seem to be able to go into China and India, Korea maybe, and to somehow work your magic despite that cultural difference. So speak to me about the sort of Eastern-Western cultural divide.
I think it's that it's not that we are 100% consistent in every single organization. There's a fundamental expectation of some things that need to be in place: recognition, celebration, communication, listening. And then every one of our businesses and facilities has a personality that's local to the region and kind of their history, and to just honor the fact that we are the combination of 140 unique histories. And each one of those might be a combination of some other histories, right? So to sort of honor that. So if I think about the challenge of going into China, so we acquired a business called K&H in Dongguan, and it was led by an entrepreneurial Chinese guy named Mr. Wu. And I remember going there during the process of deciding and trying to convince him for us to acquire his company. And the biggest principle that I applied walking in there was listening. I said, Mr. Wu, tell me how you built an amazing company like K&H. And he spoke through an interpreter the entire morning and all the way through lunch, just telling his story. And we hardly said anything.
By the way, that's exactly what we're doing right now, by the way. Yeah. So keep going.
And by the time we got to the end of the day, he was convincing me how we were going to do great things with K&H.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we didn't say a thing about what we were going to do. So, but I think we went in there, and Bob had backed away from another Chinese acquisition because he said, are we confident that we can live our culture in China? And so in this facility, it was already, we weren't starting from a really terrible place in terms of the transformation, but it was things that you look and you say, can we be confident that we can have people living in dormitories? So in this particular facility, it was people who came from the countryside and lived in dormitories, and they sent their wages home to their family. And so we just started with some fundamental things of improving living conditions, improving the kitchen, improving safety, right? And so things like that, starting to build flow, starting to have some lean principles, which the lean principles really engages people. And for the first time, they're asked for their ideas of how to make things better. And so that's
and
a
let me
form of
just let me
respect.
just bookmark.
Yeah.
Lean principles come from Japan, and so I think that there's
Yeah.
some sense in which the Asian cultures are more holistic. They are more systemic. That's
Yeah.
very deep within them, and so that means that us Westerners have much to learn from not just with Eastern spiritual traditions, but Eastern everything traditions, including business traditions.
And so it's interesting you ask, are we succeeding? How do we know we're transforming? So what's actually happening at least at the time when we acquired K&H, that the unemployment in China was rather low. And so people would go home for Chinese New Year, and a lot just wouldn't come back. They go home to their family in the countryside and decide that they're not going to travel anymore for work, or they go to a different company for just a few cents more per hour. And so what we saw transform is a change from about 60% of people coming back after Chinese New Year to 90% of people coming back after Chinese New Year. So how do you measure a cultural transformation? It's like, well, something improved there because people came back and continued to work for us. And so I think is it going to be perfect and exactly the same? And can they even accept that they should confront some people, right? So, and just things like, one of our questions in our Every Voice Matters culture assessment was, I feel that I can confront my leader with things that need to change. And then they said, oh, we can't have that question. We would never do that. Right. So there's some things you realize that you have to make adjustments. They say, oh, don't put that question in there. We would never do that. And so, and make adjustments. And then I think about then to India. And what was different in India is you talked a little bit about sort of these hierarchies and kind of expectations. And I think that when we went in and offered this learning engagement through Wehmiller University and the chance to participate, and we sent people there to teach listening skills. And they were some of the participants that wanted it the most, and that they, other classes are kind of like about 4 o'clock, you say, okay, these people are done, we need to let them go. They would want to stay till 8 just discussing the concepts. And so I think just this idea that education and being engaged in that way is such a form of respect in India. They value education so much, so that for us to see that response. And so I think there's different things in the culture that are valuable. So it's not exactly the same, but we expect the fundamental premises to be the same.
No, that's so great. Well, here's the final segment coming up here, which is I'm going to play the devil's advocate role of skeptic here. And I'm going to say, oh, this sounds so good. Prove it. And so how do we actually demonstrate, and not just prove the raw fact that these companies are turned around, but really dig deeply into the specific factors, the active ingredients, and also the contextualization that does have to take place. And so, I mean, being a business, there's all kinds of numbers that you have at your disposal. You must, just performance metrics, business performance metrics, plus other information that you gather. And I think what we hope to do together, and this podcast sort of sets it up, these 2 podcasts sets it up, is how do we actually go about systematically documenting to a skeptic's satisfaction, not only does this work again and again and again, but also how it works again and again and again. So what is the evidential basis that I think that you have, but is perhaps not as well organized as it could be, to prove to anybody, to a skeptic's satisfaction, that you have indeed found a way to transform business cultures again and again and again, 140 times and counting. So maybe we should go in reverse seniority here. David, have you begin, and then Brian and Rhonda.
Well, I feel like I want to answer a question with a question, which is I want to turn it back on you, the expert, and say, well, what do we look for as we do this? And this is, I'm asking this question in light of actually the wonderful work that you're doing with the core design principles and the frameworks that you have, because we didn't, as Barry Wehmiller, we didn't go through this with some kind of academic thing in mind and apply some rarefied theory. We just evolved this. We just tried things out and did what Bob speaks very much about, his own intuition, just someone with common sense. He often says, well, I'm just an accountant from Ferguson, Missouri. And so you're setting up, I think, a partnership to be able to say, now that we've done this, we need the help of someone who has the academic framework to go back and look back and retrospectively say, well, this is what you need to look for, and these are the measures that you need to put in place. And when you've identified these things, that will help to be able to replicate this in other places.
Well, you know what I'll do, because I was just reminded, I was just given a time check, and we really do need to wrap up this interview. So I'm going to make that like a teaser, and that's like the next chapter. And then the answer that I'll give, and then we'll have a brief checkout, is that it's just inherent in your motto, people, purpose, and product, that you're going to have some business metrics, and minimally you're going to want to show that these businesses succeed as businesses. That's the product part. But then, of course, there's the people and purpose part, and so this will be multifactorial, basically. If we want to prove that these companies succeed, we need to show that they succeed along multiple dimensions, because that's what we do. So how is the personal welfare improved? And then when we unpack the active ingredients, then we'll be using the core design principles as our guide, adaptability as our guide, also auxiliary principles. And so basically, there'll be a whole structure for doing that. But that's the teaser. I think that's what's up next. And so now I see, Michael, that you're back. Let's have a quick checkout, maybe beginning with you, Michael, and then in order of seniority, and just as brief as you want, just to wrap up this wonderful, wonderful session.
Well, I will have to listen to the entire session again. I just think it's so exciting to see you still on this conversation. I think everybody is alive and somehow alive and smiling, which is not typically the case after many conversations or meetings, etc. And so it's a testimony to just the exploration of what's humanly possible when we pay attention to the things that actually give us life. And I love that you're a biologist, the study of life.
Yeah,
right?
what am I doing here? What's a biologist doing here?
Right. But I think that's sort of the missing piece potentially, is like most organizations are dead or deadening. And that's sort of what I think also at Barry Wehmiller is you can experience, that there is an aliveness, that there are people at work, right? And that's something, as Bob would say, and as was spoken here, is like that would make such a difference in everybody's life. Like if we had life in life, I think that would be an amazing shift of how we experience, I would say, being alive. So I keep repeating.
And organizations as organisms. And so this really is about life, life forms, cultures as life forms. And this is where the big bushy tree of cultural evolution is like the big bushy tree of biological evolution. And that's why I do belong here, by the way. I wasn't saying that and that's what's so rich in terms of exploring. So thank you, Michael. And so it's such a blessing to work with you. Rhonda, what's your checkout?
Well, just the question that you ask as we need to end, Barry Wehmiller financially has grown organic growth 14% a year, compounded over 20 years, and share price growth of 17% a year, compounded over 20 years. And so there's a long-term success here by the conventional measures of business. But when we ask people how we're doing culturally, 87% of people believe that their leader cares about them as a person. So those are measures of our success. But if a skeptic came to me and said, prove it, I would say, we have to prove it every day, right? So I will guarantee you that you will find somebody in Barry Wehmiller today that feels that we let them down, and that we didn't live up to this huge promise that we made. And so we're just working every day with changing business conditions, with the challenges that face us to create and live up to this culture every day. So, so the skeptics are right from a standpoint that I'm sure that there's things that we could be doing better. And so it's a work in process.
Yeah, well, that's where, humility comes in. Humility is
Mhm.
another religious and spiritual virtue that despite we're doing great things, we don't really boast about it. We do kind of, but we're also
Kind of.
humble about what we're always room for improvement, I think is what I heard you say. So
Yep.
so Brian.
I'll build off that theme of improvement. I hope the knowledge that the work is never done and that every organization has an opportunity to improvement also makes it accessible to people. If there's one thing that I want to leave anybody listening to this with, it's that this is possible for you. It doesn't require some charismatic CEO. It doesn't require one innovative idea. Those are great things to add into the mix. But there is structure and design principles and day-to-day things that can be repeated and replicable. But we want to continue in this research because we believe after 140 acquisitions, there's some secret sauce and method to how that can be repeated, not just in the industries that we participate in, but in all kinds of organizations. And so I have hope that this can continue to cascade in other businesses, organizations, and industries.
Yeah, that's what we're working towards, is any organization or any person, any organization, business or otherwise, if they want to go down this path, if they see this as a path and they want to go down it, then we should provide help, no matter what their starting point is. And that might be working through Barry Wehmiller, it might be working through Prosocial World, it might be working through the Humanistic Management Association. But for anyone who wants to go down this path, then we turn that path basically into a super highway, you might say. So that is possible. Well, it looks like, David, you have the final word as the least senior member of Barry Wehmiller.
Well, I'm grateful for that opportunity, and slightly as an outsider, or maybe as a newcomer relatively to Barry Wehmiller and to Prosocial World, I'm very grateful to both organizations. I see a great congruency. It seems to be that both of them offer this kind of breath of fresh air in offering a different perspective on human organizations and human culture. That the traditional narrative of business is, if you want to succeed, you have to be cutthroat and you have to never care about people. And the traditional view of Darwin, before I encountered Prosocial World, I'd have said, well, the more you think about evolution, the more you realize that nature is red in tooth and claw, and it's all about fighting your way to the top and killing everybody else and succeeding in that way. And actually, I would say that this is much needed to prove to the world that both in business and in human organizations in general, you can be pro-social, you can care about people, you can be acting for the good of all of humanity, and be very successful and flourish as an organization as well.
Yeah, and that takes me back to the very beginning of my career, when my big question was, how can altruism evolve in a Darwinian world? How can prosociality evolve in a Darwinian world? That's a question that you can ask as a biologist. It's a question you could ask as a human scientist, and it's a question which is like the question for how we act in our organizations. And so that's basically the prospect before us. Well, friends, this was amazing, and I'm so happy. I think we've taken actually a sizable step, a meaningful step, in presenting all of this to anyone who is in listening range, and then acting upon it in terms of that skeptical question, prove it along multiple dimensions. I think that's the next thing that we're going to be improving upon, because in a sense we have, but we can do so much more, I think, with the mountains of information basically that we have on people, purpose, and product. The profit word is not even listed among those three. Isn't that interesting? But by not using the profit word, you actually succeed at the profit. Isn't that interesting? By facing away from something, you actually go towards it, I think, is one of the wonderful messages that we have here. Okay, so I'm going to resist the temptation to go on and on and on. Thank you for your time, and then I look forward to what will follow. Thank you so much, everyone.